Hi, I'm Alex Sudras, and welcome to Boldmethod Live Pro Pilot Edition. Tonight, we're going to take a look at 3 different instrument approaches, which you might get on an airline interview, and they're a little bit unusual. And if you're not looking for an airline interview, if you're just a general aviation pilot like Colin and I, these are approaches that you could fly in a GA aircraft as well, so they definitely pertain to you. In fact, 2 of the approaches we've flown ourselves. Tonight, I'm here in front of the camera. We got Colin Cutler as technical director, and he's also handling chat. Both Corey and Swain are flying tonight, so if you have any questions, throw them out in chat. Colin will get them worked into our presentation. Okay, so for the procedures tonight, we're looking at 3 different procedures. We're going to start with the localizer E into Aspen. Then we're going to take a look at a localizer in Gallup, New Mexico. And then finally, we're going to finish with another localizer into Vail, Colorado. Each one of them's got something that makes them very unique. You typically will not see in another approach, but at the end of the day, it could be flown by any airplane, commercial down to general aviation, and could show up in a technical airline interview. Okay, so let's get started with Aspen. This is a procedure that we've flown. It's a localizer DME-E into Aspen, Colorado. Airlines have a different restricted approach that they would fly, which is still essentially the same with a few little differences. But what makes this procedure unique, you could typically see right here in the aircraft, in the plan view. The initial approach fixes, we have 2 of them. Let me make that a little bigger. We have 2 of them. We have Red Table, VOR on top of Red Table Mountain, and we have Ajax initial approach fix over here. You'll notice this procedure does not have a procedure turn. It's a straight-in approach all the way into the runway. However, the missed approach follows a back course localizer. So let's walk through this approach. We'll go through the notes and we'll talk about how we'd fly the procedure. Okay, so first of all, let's jump into the notes section here. Okay, note number 1, dual VHF and navigation receivers are required. And if you look at this, that's because you need to be able to simultaneously receive the localizer that would guide you in on final approach and at the same time have that back course set up and in a nav receiver so that it's ready to go. And essentially, if you think about this, you'd really want to probably have one CDI if you have a dual CDI system sensing on the front course or on the final approach course, and then your second CDI already set up to monitor the back course so you don't have to change anything as you execute a missed approach. On a modern glass cockpit airplane where you typically only have one CDI available, you'd want to be able to quickly switch from nav 1 to nav 2, and you would use the back course in nav 2 so that you can tell it's already identified as you begin the approach. And if you think about it, if you were to just have your primary front course in nav 1 and then the standby frequency set to the back course for the missed approach, you'd have to wait. When you hit standby, you wouldn't necessarily know that that back course was identified and tuned correctly until you made that switch, and that's when you're turning to and navigating onto the missed approach procedure. So typically what you'd want, or what we'd want in this procedure, is to have both the front course localizer in nav 1 and then the back course missed approach localizer in nav 2. And before you start the procedure, you'd want to make sure that both of those had correctly tuned and identified, because if you need that missed, you're going to need it quickly. Okay, let's go back to the iPad. Next comment or note, procedure, let's see. Procedures not authorized at night. The visual glide slope indicators and descent angles are not coincident. So if we go down and take a look at the profile view, you'll notice that we have a 6.59 degree descent angle from DOIP, the final approach fix, down to the runway threshold. This is a published vertical descent angle. It essentially takes us from the final approach fix down through the minimum descent altitude and onto the runway's touchdown zone. It doesn't guarantee any obstacle protection once we go below MDA, but it does guarantee that if we don't hit anything on the way down, we'll end up running into the runway right in the touchdown zone. You'll notice it's 6.5 degrees, and the visual glide slope indicator for this runway would be 3.5 degrees. So let's say we're flying final at 100 knots. And if you think about this, is the first question you could typically get on an airline interview. If we're flying final at 100 knots, we're roughly around 10,000 feet when we fly this approach. So your true airspeed's 2% faster per 1,000 feet. So as opposed to going 100 knots, we're actually 20% faster because we're up at 10,000 feet. So we'd be going 120 knots, which is 2 miles per minute. What kind of descent rate would we need to make it from DOIP all the way down to the runway? Well, there's some quick mental math that we can do, and then I'll show you how we'd actually read that off the chart. But that 6.59 actually can be translated into a descent gradient. So let me sink that down. If we follow the 60-to-1 rule, that really means that we have a 659 foot per nautical mile descent gradient. It's an approximation. It's not quite that, but it's really, really close. We know that at 120 knots, we're going 2 miles a minute. So you just multiply 650 times 2. That would get you to 1,300. That's the descent rate you'd need. Or you can take a look on the Jeppesen chart. You'll notice that we were very, very close. Jepsen's computed it out to 1404, and that's because the general rule of thumb that for every degree, it's 100 feet per nautical mile. It's not quite that. It's actually 106. So 6.59 isn't quite 659 feet per nautical mile. It's really closer to 700. But you'll look at a Jeppesen chart, they actually give you descent rates for each of the different ground speeds. That's how we could figure that out, both through mental math and by looking at the chart. Okay, let's go back to those notes. The next one here is a hint. IPKN back course outbound is normal sensing. Okay, this note's been added. When I was going through training, that note wasn't on the chart. And so, at least I don't remember it being on a chart. So it made a great airline interview question. And that was, if we have to fly the missed approach procedure on this approach, when we start to fly the back course, do we have normal or reverse sensing? If you've ever flown a back course approach, you typically, if you're using a traditional CDI indicator, have reverse sensing. If you're flying with the HSI and you set the front course in, you'll have correct sensing. But with a traditional VOR indicator on a back course, if you're flying a back course approach, you typically have reverse sensing. But that's because you're going the wrong direction. So let's take a look at this. A back course is essentially a mirror image of the front course. And that's because the localizer array is located right here at the end of the runway, and it projects two lobes. We'll call it the blue lobe over here, and then the white lobe over here. And basically, all your VHF receiver is doing is comparing your position between the two lobes and drawing you right down the center. So this would be the normal approach, taking you into the runway. You'll notice then that those lobes are mirrored on the opposite side. You could call it the back side or the back course. And if you're flying straight out on the back course, you will continue to have correct sensing. So essentially, if you look at the way they're shaded, and the shading really gives you the hint. Okay, the shading should be on the right wing when you're flying with correct sensing. So if you look at this, you got the shading. This is the way it's meant to be flown. The shading's off your right wing. As we start to fly along the back course, the shading remains off our right wing, so we still have correct sensing. Now let's take a look at that procedure. Okay, as we're coming in, the shading, I'll make that permanent. This part right here would be off the aircraft's right wing, like we would expect to be on a normal localizer, so it's correct sensing. But if we execute the missed approach, so we turn and now we're flying along that back course, you'll notice the shading is still off the aircraft's right wing, and so we would have correct sensing. It's nice that Jeppesen puts that note there. if you're not using a Jeppesen chart, if you're using an FAA chart, they typically write it in the profile or in the plan view. But again, it's good to know just by the shading whether the aircraft is going to get correct or reverse sensing. Okay, looks like we have our first question.
Okay, first question here, and you hit on this just a little bit, Alex, and that is, how do you figure out what the VGSI angle is? It said there was a note on there saying that the angle on the approach and the VGSI were not coincident. How would you figure out what that visual glide slope is going to be?
Okay, so there's a couple things. Typically, you'll see it either published, let me see, on the FAA chart. Let's go in there. You can see it published in the profile view. So in this case, the VGSI angle is 3.5 and our descent angle is 6.59. So you'd see it on FAA charts typically written in the profile view. On Jeppesen charts, if you go back to the chart, you'll notice it doesn't show up on this plate. The 3.5 doesn't show up on this plate or on this chart. And that's because they've put it on the airport information chart. So if we were to go to the, let me pull it up. I don't have it in here, but I can get it in ForeFlight. And now I'm looking right at the time for it. There we go, right in the middle. So you can see for runway 15, they list the lighting types: medium intensity runway lighting, medium intensity approach light system with sequenced flashing lights, a PAPI on the left side, and its angle is 3.5 degrees. So on a Jeppesen chart, you would actually look at the airport additional information page. Okay, let's take a look at the next approach. And that's the localizer runway 6 into Gallup. So procedure turns. Everybody's familiar with the Holden-Lewin procedure turn, and we're typically familiar with the 45, 180, 45 barb. Those are the standard procedure turns that you see in the National Airspace System. But you can also have a teardrop procedure turn. These are significantly less common. You may see them at military airfields, but at civilian airfields, you really don't see them very often. But there is one just south of us in Gallup, New Mexico. So we'll take a look at that procedure. If you take a look, you can see the initial approach fix here is the Gallup VOR. From there, you're going to follow the 226 radial outbound from the VOR, which, by the way, does not line up with this missed approach holding pattern. The 226 radial outbound from the VOR. Then you'll execute a 180-degree turn, and you'll proceed inbound on the 062 course from the localizer. This procedure that you see right here is a teardrop procedure turn. It's always an option if you have a 45, 180, 45 barb depicted on the procedure, but since this is drawn, it's actually mandatory. So how would you fly this teardrop procedure turn? Well, if you're equipped with a GPS and your GPS is navigating the approach, the GPS will typically guide you all the way through that procedure turn, that teardrop turn, right on a final. It'll maintain not a constant bank angle rate, but it'll choose the rate of turn necessary to get you essentially from that 226 radial all the way onto the localizer course. The faster you go, typically the steeper bank and the faster rate of turn it will take. But how would you do this if we weren't using the GPS? Obviously, all these procedures can be flown with just VOR and DME information. So how could you do this with just VOR and DME information? Well, first of all, let's take a look at how many degrees we're turning. So if you look at that teardrop, it's not a 30-degree teardrop, it's actually a 16-degree teardrop. And we know that because if we look at 226 here, that's the outbound radial. Again, ignore the holding pattern. It's close, but it does not line up. 226 If you take the reciprocal of that, that's 0.46. And then compare that to 0.62. That means we have 16 degrees, essentially 16 degrees from here to here. So it's a 16-degree teardrop. And then we can use a little bit of the 60-to-1 rule. So the 60-to-1 rule says at 60 miles, for every degree, you will cross 1 mile. Okay? At 30 miles, every degree takes 1/2 of a mile. At 15 miles out from a VOR or a source, every degree takes 1/4 of a mile. And at 7.5 miles, every degree takes 1/8 of a mile. Okay, so essentially, we're just taking 60-to-1. Okay, it's 60 miles out from a point. Every degree of an arc is 1 mile. Divide it in half, you get 30. That's a 1/2 mile. Divide it in half again, you get 15.25. Divide it in half again, you get 7.5 and 1/8. And on this procedure, that actually works out pretty well. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We need to remain within 10 nautical miles. And that's 10 nautical miles from the VOR. That's the point where we begin our teardrop procedure turn. So what you could say is, well, what if we started our turn maybe close to 7.5? That would make sense. Okay, we know at 7.5 miles from the VOR, every degree takes 1/8 of a mile. This is a 16-degree procedure turn. 16 degrees from here to here. So 8/8 would be 1 mile. 16/8 would be 2 miles. Essentially, 60 degrees, it's going to be 2 miles. You'll notice, though, that the VOR is offset. And this is something people don't think about using very often, but there's a scale depicted on the chart. A lot of people don't even notice that the scale is there. But essentially 0, 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles. So this little gap is about 1 mile. And if we look at this, that's not quite to the gap between the VOR's position and the center of the localizer. So maybe about 1/2 mile. So if you think about that, essentially at 7.5 miles, this line right here, if we were to measure this line right here, that would come down to about 2.5 nautical miles. Okay, so essentially, if we start our turn around 7.5 miles from the VOR, we're going to need to eat up 2.5 miles of space to turn on the localizer. So, what rate of turn would we need to do that? Well, there's an easy way to figure out your diameter of a 180-degree turn, and that is to take 1% of your true airspeed. Now, this doesn't account for wind drift, but if you take 1% of your true airspeed, that essentially gives you your diameter, not your radius, but the full diameter of a 180-degree turn. Okay, so if we were flying this procedure at 120 knots, which is typically the speed that we would use to enter a procedure in a Cirrus SR-22, at 120 knots, take 1% of that, that's 1.2. That would be roughly the diameter of our turn. Okay, and it's not quite exact. As I said, if you work out the math, you could do that. You take true airspeed on the top, divide that by your rate of turn times 20 times pi. If you work that number out, you'll end up with 1.24 something. So it's a little bit off, but not much. So the 1% rule works well. So you say, okay, 1.2 nautical miles, go back to the chart. That really only gets us halfway there. If we started our turn at 7.5 miles out, 1.2 nautical miles would really just get us to right about here. Well, we have two options. We could fly a standard rate turn and then take an intercept angle. That would work. Or what we could do is take a half standard rate turn, which essentially doubles the distance. So at 120 knots, if a standard rate turn takes 1.2 miles, a half standard rate turn will take twice as much, so about 2.4 miles. And if you look at 2.4 miles, that's going to get us just about right on to that localizer course. So in this case, if I was flying this by hand at 120 knots with light winds, I would start my turn about 7 to 7.5 miles out, and I would use a half standard rate turn. The diameter of the turn would take up 2.4 miles, which would come really close to putting me on that localizer course. Would I stay within my 10-mile protected zone? Again, I'm starting at roughly 7.5 miles. We'll divide that diameter in half, so you're back to 1.2. Add 1.2 to 7.5, so you're going to get about 8.8. Yeah, you're inside that protected area. That's one way you could do the math. Now, I know this sounds incredibly complicated, and at the end of the day, we all operate in a world where everything is computed for us. And we look at E6Bs, I mean, there isn't a big reason to learn how to use this anymore. But keep in mind, if you were flying in the 50s, you're flying a jet in the 50s or a turboprop in the 50s or a radial engine airliner in the 50s, and you've got you and your co-pilot and your flight engineer, these are the kinds of things that they were working out in the cockpit as they flew. Not as they were flying that teardrop procedure turn, they'd be working them out ahead of time. They would be figuring out, okay, we've got 16 degrees, start to turn about 7, so it's about 1/8 of a degree or 1/8 of a mile per degree. So we got 2 miles. VOR is offset by half, so we need to eat up 2.5 miles. We'll fly a half standard rate turn at 120 knots. That should get us right about on the localizer. That kind of math, that's kind of how instrument flying started. So if you want to kind of go away from the Magenta line, everybody picks on new pilots today. They say, well, you don't know how to fly without a Magenta line. Try doing some of that mental math. It ends up working out pretty accurately. Okay, looks like we have a question.
All right, we are going to start out with this. We've got a question in, and that is, the VOR and the profile view of this gallop approach that you have up has a gray shape underneath it. What is that?
Good question. The VOR that we've got up there's got, that kind of tan gray shape. That is a mountain. So it's up on a hill. And then something a lot of people aren't familiar about, you might be asking this as well. If you look, the dot is the VOR, and you end up with this kind of funky, kind of looks like a gold seal with a compass around it. That's the way Jeppson indicates a VOR. And then you can look over here to see whether it's got DME, and then you get your frequency and your Morse code. If we were to look at an FAA chart, you're going to see it's shown, whoa, that is a big arrow. It is shown with the traditional vortex symbol. And then you'll see the DME channel down there. The fact that it's drawn in a vortex channel or symbol tells you that it's got DME. And then also the channel number at the bottom is a hint that it's got DME as well. Okay, next question.
And Alex, the profile view, if you look at the profile view, the gray shape, I think that's what they were asking about on the Jeppson chart.
Okay, this is another great airline interview question. You'll notice that and now we have a small error. There we go. There we go. You'll notice that this VOR is broken and you don't see it extend all the way down to the ground. That means that the VOR is not part of the final approach course. It's offset. So if you take a look, we call it a broken line. And if you look at that, it matches up. The VOR isn't on the final approach course. FAA charts don't do that, so you have to compare both the plan and the profile view. But anytime you see only part of a line, it drops, it's broken or torn off, that means that that nav aid is not located on the final approach course. And actually, I don't have a procedure at the top of my head, but I can tell you there are some procedures when you look at that plan view, and it looks like the nav aid might be on the final approach course, but you can't quite tell. On a Jeppson chart, the easiest thing to do is to look at the profile view. If it doesn't extend all the way down to the ground, it means the fix might be part of the procedure, but it is not located on top of the final approach course. Okay, again, in a modern flight management computer, flight management driven airplane, or in an airplane with RNAV capabilities like anything using a Garmin 430 or, doesn't even have to be a glass panel, just a GPS RNAV driven procedure. If you load the procedure, the GPS will start your turn, and it usually, on this procedure, it starts at about 8 miles. It brings you all the way out to about 9.6. And it will choose your angle of bank, your rate of turn, to fit your airspeed. But you could do this entire thing with math. And if you were flying this without RNAV, that's exactly what you do. So you know, okay, I'm going to need to take an intercept. You can kind of judge the rate of turn that you would do. So you end up close to that localizer course when you roll out. Okay, let's take a look at our last procedure today. And that's going to be the localizer into Vail, Colorado. So I will load that up. It's Eagle Airport, EGE, and the procedure itself is fairly straightforward. There is no procedure turn, but if you take a look, let's see, our initial approach fixes here are, we have VOXA right here. I'll switch to blue. We have VOXA right here, and I think that is our only initial approach fix. We have some feeder routes that start at the Kremling VOR, but you'll notice it doesn't say IAF. We have a variety of published holding patterns. You can see all these holding patterns here. These holding patterns are published patterns because they end up with a lot of backup traffic when the weather is low going into Vail. And so number like this here is a pattern that they could put people on. Plus they have an alternate missed approach holding pattern right here. So if for some reason they can't use this, or sorry, the published missed approach pattern here at Jesse, ATC can give you a separate procedure that will send you to this approach. We'll talk about that in a second. But our initial approach fix is VOXA. From there, we'll come down to Aquila. From there to our intermediate fix, you can see it says IF, so that's our intermediate fix of Weehall. From there into Agile, to Washi, down to Sipku. That is our missed approach point. Okay, from there, you can see here it's got the M for missed approach point. From there, we end up with these kind of funny looking arrows. You'll see them both on the profile view, and you'll also see those funny looking arrows on the plan view. And if you look at an FAA chart, you'll see the same thing. This again, huge, there we go. This dash with an arrow. So that is a fly visual to the airport. And what do we learn? To descend below MDA or DA, we always need three things, right? We need to be in a position for a continuous and normal descent to landing. We need to have the airport or runway we need to have the runway environment in sight, not the airport, but the runway environment in sight, which can include the approach lights, but unless you see the red terminating or side row bars, you can't go down below 100 feet above touchdown. It can include the threshold lights, the threshold markings. It can include the glide slope, it could, or the visual glide slope indicator. It can include your touchdown zone or the touchdown zone markings. It can include the runway or the runway markings, and it can include the runway and identifier lights. So those are the 10 things that we need to be able to see, or one of those things that needs to be seen to go below MDA or DA. Plus we need flight visibility. So one of those 10 things, required flight visibility, and in a position for a normal and continuous descent to landing. But then they can create what they call a fly visual to the airport. And that essentially says, okay, well, you don't need to be able to descend yet, and you don't even need to be able to see the airport. You can just fly visually with the required flight visibility as long as you have ground contact, and maintain ground contact and the required flight visibility until you see the airport. Now, if we go back to that Jepson chart, you'll notice it says for LDA with glide slope, fly visual to the airport, 250 degrees, 4.3 nautical miles, authorized during the day only. So that means if you get to your decision altitude on the glide slope, okay, and you do not see the runway or the airport, or you don't see the runway environment, but you do have the required flight visibility and you can see the ground, you can continue from the missed approach point to the runway as long as you can maintain you're clear of clouds, you have the required flight visibility, and you could see the ground, and you would fly a dead reckoning course of 250 degrees at 4.3 nautical miles. So our required flight visibility for this procedure is 3 miles. You would have to have 3 miles of flight visibility throughout that maneuver to do it. The problem is, once you depart the missed approach point, obstacle protection is your own responsibility. So as you leave SIPCU, the missed approach point, and start your fly visual segment, you might have 3 miles of visibility and ground contact, but you may not have the runway in sight. And so at that point in time, It's up to you to see and avoid obstacles, and there is no more published missed approach procedure. I mean, you can go back to it, but there's no obstacle protection afforded on that fly visual segment. So if you elect to initiate a missed approach procedure, obstacle clearance protection is completely up to you. It is your responsibility until you're back established on the missed approach segment and you're at a climb gradient that puts you above the obstacle clearance plane. So really, fly visuals to the airport are kind of a hazardous approach because you might get past the missed approach point legally, but you can't see the runway yet. And if you're unable to find the runway, missed approach can be very, very difficult. You'll notice it says on the chart, it is authorized during the day only. You'll notice though, if you look at the minimums, they include both day minimums and night minimums if you're flying the LDA with a glide slope. What that essentially means is the LDA with a GS. If you're flying the LDA down using the glide slope down to a decision altitude of 830 feet during the day, and once you reach DA, you can see the ground and you have 3 nautical miles of flight visibility, you can continue along the fly visual segment until you see the runway and you can land. However, at night, you can't use the fly visual segment. So in that case, you would still be able to continue down to 830 feet decision altitude, 8,330 feet decision altitude. But once you reach that 8,330 foot decision altitude, you would need to have 5 miles of flight visibility, and you'd need to be in a position for a normal continuous descent to landing, and you would need to have the runway environment, any of those 10 items in sight. So you could not use the fly visual segment. You'd have to see one of those runway items before you can land. They also have an option if the glide slope is out. So this is the localizer directional aid without glide slope, and you'll notice that they raise the minimum descent altitude to 8,620 feet. And in this case, the fly visual doesn't apply. One other thing to think about here, why is this a localizer directional aid, an LDA, as opposed to a loc? That's because the LDA is offset. It's not lined up with the runway. So as opposed to coming straight into the runway, it actually kind of comes, let me draw that a little bit thinner. It comes in across the runway. And that's what an LDA is. You won't be necessarily lined up with the runway. Try that again. See it right there. An LDA is the exact same thing as a localizer. It just means that once you reach the runway, the LDA is no longer lined up. It's not lined up with the pavement. You'll have to actually turn the aircraft to line up with the runway. Okay, looks like we have a question.
Okay, next question is this. Do all LDAs have glide slopes?
They don't. They're just like localizers. You'll find some that do have glide slopes and some that don't. The key thing is a localizer is still aligned with the runway. And if it's got a glide slope, then it's an ILS. An LDA, it's this exact same system. It's just not lined up with the runway. They may choose to install a glide slope with it if they can protect the glide slope plane. Otherwise, it may just be an LDA all by itself. And you'll see these at a variety of places. You see LDAs sometimes in the mountains. You can also find them like at Salt Lake International. They use an LDA for one of their runways there just so that the final approach course doesn't conflict with other traffic patterns. So that's another reason you'd have an LDA. Okay, looks like we have another question.
Okay, next one is coming up on the missed approaches here, and that is, it's pretty simple. Can you explain the different missed approach procedures on this approach?
Absolutely. So if you take a look at the missed, let's start by reading the missed. Okay, so in this case, we're going to climb direct to the snow VOR, cross the snow VOR, then climbing right turn to 14,600 feet, outbound on the snow VOR radial 001 to Jesse intersection, which is also DME 24.2 from snow VOR, and hold, continue your climb and hold up to 14,600 feet. This missed approach is intended for the primary published missed approach pattern. So in this case, you're going to continue straight to the snow VOR. You can see the LDA actually will lead you right to the VOR very closely, but you could switch and track to the snow VOR. Okay. From there, once you cross, you're going to turn and continue to track the 001 radial to Jesse, and then you'll enter the holding pattern. And if you take a look at this, you could choose to do either a teardrop or a parallel entry. Either one of those would be acceptable. Okay, however, we have this alternate missed approach pattern over here, and you'll notice there are no instructions for it. So with alternate missed approach patterns, they publish the missed approach pattern on the chart so that the crew can reference the published holding pattern to help figure out their entry and the turns and all that in the hold. Essentially, they draw them on there to make the holding pattern easier for you to fly. However, they do not print the alternate missed approach instructions on the chart. They don't print them on the chart because they don't want you to confuse them with the normal missed approach procedure and fly the wrong missed approach procedure. If ATC is going to give you an alternate missed approach to an alternate missed approach hold, they will give you that procedure verbally over the radio. So they will read out the procedure they want you to fly, specifying that alternate missed approach fix. Then you will fly that procedure. That fix is charted and published on the chart so that you have it as a reference. It makes it easier to fly the pattern and determine the entry. But ATC, they'll issue you the instructions if they need you to fly it. Okay. That looks like all the time that we have for tonight. Our next show will be 2 weeks from now. So there's links in the description. We'd like you to let us know what you'd like us to talk about next time, what ProPilot or IFR topics that we could cover, and in general, your comments and feedback. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hope to see you in 2 weeks.